On behalf of Toto Funds the Arts, let me welcome one and all to this conversation. TFA is a not-for-profit public trust that aims to promote young talent in the arts. It gives away annual awards in the categories of music, short film, photography, creative writing, and digital art. Today, I'm going to be in conversation with the 4 writers shortlisted for the Toto in 2023 for creative writing in English. 2 of them will win the award at the event in Bengaluru on February 18th. My name is Aswin Vijayan, and I am an assistant professor in the Zamarins Guru Ayappan College, Kozhikode. I'm a poet whose chapbook under the handstand statue man was published last year. Last year, I was also one of the 2 winners of the Toto for English. It is an honor for me to be the host of this conversation. We have with us 4 incredibly talented young writers, 2 each shortlisted for prose and poetry. Let me introduce them one by one. First, Tushar Rishi is a poet and prose writer whose first novel, The Patient, was published in 2016 and was translated into Hindi in 2018. He's a literature graduate from Hindu College, University of Delhi. Swati Singh is a poet who is also interested in performance poetry, translation, and illustration. They are currently a teaching fellow at Ashoka University. Moachiba Jamir is a writer hailing from Nagaland, Kohima. He graduated from EFLU, is an Iowa International Writers Program alum, and is also part of the Writers Beyond Borders program. Finally, Aparna Chivukula is from Bengaluru. She teaches at Mount Carmel College, and her poetry has most recently appeared in Poetry at Sangam's New Indian Poetry issue. So welcome all 4 of you. And first of all, congratulations on being shortlisted for this year's TFA. And we will start with Tushar. I have a set of questions ready for each of you, and I'll start with Tushar. Hello, Tushar.
Hi, Ashwin. Hi, everyone.
Hi. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
So it is a fantastic experience to read through your stories, especially Broken Crayons, and there are some significant themes that you kind of come back to again and again in your poetry, be it in your poetry, be it in your prose. There are certain themes that you come to. And in Broken Crayons, they kind of take the center stage and the focus, right? Illness, cancer, amputation, and it can be of the speaker themselves or of those around the speaker. So this is something that you have come to quite frequently. So can you talk about how you bring these themes into your literary experience? Like how do you use it as a filter for personal experiences, traumatic experiences, or is there a distance that you create through expressing these experiences in literature?
So as for the personal literary expression as a way of dealing with personal trauma, I would say yes, to some extent, works of this kind, because it stems from personal experience. They do have some therapeutic value for me. But I would also highlight the fictional aspect of the story and the narrative aspect, which does not imitate or does not record what actually happened, but instead the narrative and the fiction that gives me the space to explore the questions around what happened in a more condensed way. So with this story, I was interested in exploring questions of surviving, questions of post-illness, and questions of guilt and shame.
Yeah.
And also an important question for me was how do people build a community around illness? Because in the story, the protagonist goes to a support group meeting of cancer survivors, and obviously the underlying the common theme of that group is not say a caste or a religion or some other aspect of identity, but it's the human body and illness. So I was interested in how this community is formed and how what sort of pressure, what sort of different kinds of pressures this community has to face. So with illness and disability, there is an aspect of what we call sort of inspirational. I don't know how to say it exactly, but there's a pressure to inspire others. Disability and surviving is seen as sort of inspirational, and I wanted to examine that. So yeah, that was one of the aims which pushed me towards fictionalizing it in a more literary narrative way, because an earlier draft of this was more personal and more sort of I would say more true to the real events. But when I rewrote it entirely, I chose to import certain like create incidents and create events which did not really happen, which are fictional, but which helps me reach for a deeper understanding of those real events, perhaps. So yeah, I think there is an element of personal trauma, but also a fictional.
Yeah, something that you just mentioned is something that struck with me when I was reading it. The character Manny, right, who presents almost to an extent of toxic positivity, like presenting the life of a survivor almost to an extent that it becomes a necessity to present oneself as such. It was such a touching depiction. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that particular character and characterization?
Yeah, so it is something that I would say it's not just limited to this character, but it's like I said, it's a phenomenon, like it's a widespread phenomena with people with disabilities, that when they have to present themselves to the world, there are certain templates of experience that they show that, okay, this happened, but now I fought back and now I'm doing things that any normal person can do.
Yes.
So there is this normal which the person has to somehow reach towards. And Manny obviously subscribes to this understanding of himself. And but I don't know how it comes across to other people in this other readers. But I did not mean to parody that sort of
absolutely.
Because there's also that mistakes.
I do not think it parodies, but rather it brings into focus that aspect, that necessity. And because there is a lot of conversation going on, especially in literature and also in comedy, so to speak, that this performance of trauma kind of becomes a necessity to fulfill oneself. So that's a sense of performance of trauma. It's not necessarily a commentary on the individual, but rather on the system that encourages that sort of that sort of a performance. And I think that characterization quite clearly brings that out, because the speaker is sympathetic to Manny, now understands the situation that Manny is in, and understands exactly what and why he does what he does. So I think you have done quite justice to that character. And as an extension of this, I would also like to point out another aspect, another quirk of character that you kind of brings out in this particular story. You have this ability to bring in the silly into the very serious, and that there is that moment when the speaker has written down his name on the name card and pins it onto his shirt and has this urge to smudge the name, and that childishness, that very unserious act in a very serious setting. Like, what do you think is the importance of those moments of levity in very serious situations, both in life and in literature?
So this was something that I think I've learned from experience, being around people with cancer and being myself a cancer survivor, but mostly from other cancer patients, that obviously there is an understanding of the gravity of the situation, and death and mortality being very urgent questions for such people. But within that serious framework, there is also always an urge towards a tendency towards joy, and the impulse to laugh and impulse to, I think, laugh at oneself and our own situation. I think that sort of is something that I always want to preserve in my stories, to not just let it be all just serious all the way, but have these little moments where the characters experience these interruptions of joy in between these very serious, and like you said, as a serious situation. And this, I think, I don't know why exactly, what function does it serve in the story, or what function does it serve for the reader who's reading. But for me, when I was editing this story, I did think about removing this, because it's just 1 or 2 lines, just a small moment where I thought I should remove it. Maybe it's just lighting the mood a bit at this point in the story. But for some reason, I felt that it adds to that character, and that's why I decided to keep it. Yeah.
I think it is the small moments that humanizes other characters a lot more, right? Like when even when we are stuck in very serious situations, some of our impulses are like, doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. And I'm glad that you decided to keep it in your final edit. And moving on to talking about the seriousness of the content and theme that you present in your work. Even when you are discussing extremely personal themes in your poetry, may it be in your poetry, may it be in your prose, even when you are discussing something extremely personal, you have this ability and tendency to foreground the social implication of individual action and the political repercussions of individual action. And what in your sense as a writer is the purpose, the political purpose of art itself? Like what do you think of, like, do you think of it quite a bit? Like, does it become a serious concern in the way you approach your practice of writing?
So my understanding of this would be that I think art, or anything that exists in this world, is by default political. Like, we cannot escape that aspect, the political. But yeah, to highlight it in a narrative, to foreground it, is a different question. And I do that, especially in Broken Crayons. I do that because I wanted to expand the community. So there's this individual who goes to this support group meeting, and that is a community, that is one community, but obviously there is a larger world beyond that community, and I wanted to incorporate that awareness of that world.
Yes.
And yeah, there is a moment towards the end of sort of explicit contemporary politics commentary.
Yes.
And that I felt, because the character is a university student at that point. And in that context, I think that gave me a way to incorporate that social world, while also problematizing that at the same time, not that outside, like the political world, the context of that story. Without, I wanted to just incorporate that in a very direct way, because I wanted to examine how this character belongs or does not belong to that sort of group identity of so that, because they go to the farmers protest rally.
Yes.
And there's a question of belonging and not belonging. So I think that I wanted to have that in the story as well. As for the purpose of art, political purpose of art, I don't know if there's a clear goal in my mind, when a political goal as such. that I have for art. But yeah, I think if there is a purpose, I think it's to just create certain like awareness about what we sometimes choose to forget. So and with this story, I felt that the sort of discourse around cancer and illness is a bit skewed toward inspirational narratives, which has a narrative structure of illness and then recovery and then sort of one sort of a most cancer narratives that we see have this. It ends in a moment of triumph.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see this other side of this story here within this one. So yeah, that's I don't have a clear political purpose of art.
But I think you do present your stance quite clearly, and also from what you have presented, you have the way you have responded to this question, like makes me think about the story, that ending of the story quite like in a quite in a more holistic way, right? Because yes, the individual is not 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 this part of being the this as a cancer survivor is not the only identity that the individual lives through. Like all of us have multiple group identities that we identify with at every moment of our lives, and I think it's a fantastic way. Like I quite enjoy the way you have entered that story, that sort of a non-resolution that you bring to the story is quite satisfactory for the reader. And with that, I would like to go on to my last question to you, and which is more alongside some of the formal choices that you make. And I find it very fascinating that we have in Chicken Days, the other story. I want you to talk a little bit about that choice that you make of what kind of a speaker we have. In Chicken Days, we have a boy speaker dreaming of eating chicken, while Broken Crayons introduces right away a more worldly young man dreaming about sex. So the dreams themselves of the speaker like kind of sets them apart from each other, right? So what what is your process usually when you think about writing a story? Like what kind of a speaker do you want for the story? What amount of distance you ascribe to yourself and the speaker? What are your choices usually when you think about it in the formal level?
Ashwin, before coming to this question, I would just when you said about the previous question that you asked, and you mentioned the word resolution, like I think that I wanted to point out. I think that's the like resolution within the narrative is a political sort of maneuver if we resolve the story within the narrative. And I think so I don't tend to do that. And I think for me the fact that these questions are staged and I get to think these questions and the reader gets to think through these questions in the story. I think that is what I aim towards and not resolution. Yeah.
Great.
So, okay, coming to this question. So with Chicken Days, I was, there's the child protagonist is also a narrator who is narrating after certain time has passed.
Yes.
Of the narration through memory, and again there are emotions of guilt and shame, which is linked around like questions of identity. So I think with that, with that story, I just wanted to see this child protagonist and this voice, and I did not have a plan as such. I just wanted to follow this voice and see where it goes with this story, especially just trying to make sense of this adult world and its contradictions. That's what I wanted to do, and it it goes towards takes a dark turn in the end. But with Broken Crayons, I'm glad that you noticed that that mention of that dream in the beginning. Because even that I was very dicey about, should I keep this, should I remove this, because what does it add to this story? And then I asked myself, why did I write it in the first place? And I think that comes from this. I think it has, for me, it has certain. There's an aspect of sexuality and disability that I think I've not thought this through, but I think that when I was editing that, I thought, okay, this is where it is coming from. This is this character would have a sort of, there has to be a sexual aspect of this identity which I need to just have in the story.
Yeah.
And yeah, but it's we should also remember that because it's the character, it's a like hungover dream, so it's also there's an aspect of yeah, and that's why I kept the 2-3 dreams that I mentioned, and as I said, let's be random, and I think I shouldn't think too much about this and have that randomness. So yeah, I don't think I have any thing else to say to that.
I think once again, these things are what humanizes your characters, right? Like things that are seemingly random, so seemingly does not fit too neatly into the logic of the world. Those things make the characters much more human, and I think you have a fantastic story, and I wish you good luck. Okay, thank you, Tushar, for responding to my question so gracefully. Thank you.
You.
I request Swati to, let's have a conversation about your poems now, which once again deal with a lot of issues, including illnesses and mental illnesses, ADHD, things like that. You have those are things that you talk about in quite at quite some length. Shall we begin there? Like, shall we start talking about that? You talk about illness, gender dysphoria, queerness, and all of these things. So once again, is this a difficult compulsion, as one would say? Like, what, do you feel this necessity to speak about these things, or is there some sort of therapeutic quality to the writing that you do about your personal experiences?
Compulsion is such a good word to use for what's been happening with these poems. Oh my god. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's I feel like with the kind of things that just being a person entails, there's so much hiding involved in what you do with your life to ensure your safety as a queer person. Or at least in my experience, it's been like that. And with illnesses, with this whole idea of having to mask to fit into a certain expectation, which is social or whatever kind of expectation, it becomes quite difficult. And then, of course, being able to articulate something has a therapeutic value, but also these are invisible, intangible things. What is queerness? What's a gender? what's your gender? It's so weird. Like, it's so difficult for me to try to conceptualize these things, and to I don't think that I can put queerness with illness in the same bracket, because that's a different set
Definitely.
of experiences, which
Absolutely.
but with the things that happen with illness, mental illness, things that are like invisible, it's so difficult to make it tangible.
Yes.
And there's this like sociologist whose ethnographic study site is pain. Her name is Elaine Scarry, and she talks about how pain is one of those things that just defies language. And on the other hand, you have this impulse to talk about what's happening with you, in like knowing that every attempt that you're going to make at it is just going to like fail at some level. And like it's a very freeing sort of thing for me, so that I'm like, okay, now I can write about this thing. It's fine, it's okay. And it it does have its own like therapeutic value, yes, because then this invisible, like intangible, weird thing that sometimes I is this just inside my head, I come down, I put it onto a paper and I give it some words, and then it exists in my head but also on the page. And that's nice, and sometimes it can be funny, and like I can show it to my friends, and like we can take something that's not fun and then laugh about it. And that I think is the like best part of this. But yeah, it's compulsive for sure.
It's interesting that you say that, right? Like that sort of a distance that it creates, almost like reading someone else writing about you, right? When you read your own words from a paper, like it feels like you have created a distance. But you also fall strictly into a tradition, right? With your poem biodata, kind of like remind immediately made me recall Kamala Das's poem Introduction, where there are so many multiple identities that pile upon one upon another, and you present yourself, you assert yourself that all of this is me and this is all of me, and that sort of presentation, I think it's quite fantastic. Do you want to talk a little bit about that poem, or poems like uh, any specific poem, especially that poem? Uh,
Oh yeah, I wrote that poem when I was really like very upset with being ascribed certain identities. And just yeah, my family like was going to have a wedding, and there was this whole like biodata nonsense happening. And it just came from personal place of pure spite. and, and like just this desire to try to be like, okay, I'm and how do I define myself in this language uh, of definitions, like which is a very, it's very reductive, this whole biodata business. And it, it seemed also like, at the same time, despite it being reductive, it seemed like a fun format to try. And yeah, I think that's where that came from. But I do enjoy like picking up these like things that are traditional and then playing with them slightly.
quite fascinating. Like I do see that sort of a playfulness in the kind of but what I want to focus the next question on is something that covers the answers to the two previous questions, right? Like this sort of a multiple identity. You are a poet, you are a performance poet, you are a translator, you are an illustrator. So you identify with these different aspects of yourself. So how do they overlap? How do they make themselves present and visible in your writing? I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
So I think each of them contribute to the writing in different ways. Um, because I think for me, translation is what really, I was translating someone else's poems from Hindi to English when I sort of began to understand how poetry really works, because that was my first encounter with like really close reading. And then when when I really began to work with different languages, and not as like a translator, but just sort of observe the different languages that I live in, it it just became very difficult for me to keep those languages out of my work, because I come from a place that is very multilingual. I grew up in different places, where in when I was growing up in Lucknow, the language was like a mixture of English and Hindi and Urdu, and you didn't know where one ended and the other began. And before my family moved to Lucknow, we were living on a farm in Uttarakhand where there was a mixture of like Hindi and Punjabi and English and all these like different languages, even Kumaoni and Garhwali every now and then, which would interact with each other, and they would become like this part of this like archive of experiences that I now dip into to sort of try and express anything that I feel. And it feels very difficult for me to try and like keep it limited to one language or one form. Partly because I'm not I know that there are writers who are very good at this and who do this really well, but I'm just not there yet personally. And when it comes to like writing, for me, like the it's just very difficult for me to also just think of writing in terms of only words. uh the word, like, for the ancient Greek word for writing, for instance, was graphos, which is the same word that they use for drawing. And when you are like trying to to write something, when I am trying to write something, I try very hard not to be like, okay, this is the only way that I can tell this story. So try to I try to include visual imagery in my stories or in my poems. In these ones, I think the first couple of poems, which are like the more rhyming poems, you won't find it as much. But the later ones, the ones that are not in any traditional form, I try my best to evoke those visual senses, which I uh, sort of was so captivated by, which led me to writing that poem. And when it comes to it being an aspect of like performance poetry, I think uh, noticing the way that my body is saying a word, or the way that I am breathing when I am constructing a sentence, becomes an essential part of this writing practice and the practice of reading poetry as well. So I think those are the ways, but also it's just really helpful to be able to go from one thing to the next, because it's very frustrating to like keep failing at the same thing over and over again. So it's nice to like, you know, like not be able to write a poem. Okay, go crochet like 2 lines or something.
So it's quite interesting, like especially when you talk about translation and dipping into these various pots of language, right? Or almost to draw into your poetry that you are writing in one specific language. So this is this kind of, when you talked about it, it kind of reminded me of Seamus Heaney's uh, like in his Nobel lecture. He talks about how as a child he had this experience of listening to radio, and this was almost his exposure to a new world altogether, words, languages, things that sounded so different, so distant, but so familiar, from all over the radio, messages from all over the world about war and things that you don't experience around you. He lived in a farm as a child, but none of that is actually happening around him, but these things through those words, through language, kind of enters into this whole experience of being a child. And I think that's quite interesting when you talk about that experience of living in multiple languages, because we all do on a daily basis. We live in multiple languages, we switch language as we speak, and we to survive also we speak multiple languages. We speak one language with the auto driver, with the vegetable vendor, with the people who works for us, people for whom we work, and like we speak different languages, we switch and we survive. And you use that technique in your poetry quite interestingly, interlinguistic technique, so to say, like of introducing languages. You have even a ghazal with Urdu as one of the the repeating words, and you have certain words that you keep repeating. One of the interesting things that I found was in one of the ghazals for that rhyme, you have used English words and Hindi words in tandem, so to create that sort of a rhyme. What is your general? You have talked a little bit about. Can you talk a little bit more about that relationship between other languages and English while you are writing? How much do you dip into it, and how much does it help you express yourself completely?
I think that for me, it helps me express myself in an honest fashion, especially when I am writing about like a close relationship, for example. And if I'm writing a love poem, and that is the language, like the interactions that I have when I'm in love with someone who I'm really close to, are they won't be just in English. So for me, then if I'm writing a love poem, for me to be like very honest about it, conversational about it, I think I do need to, transition to like the language that I would use every day. uh i I find, yeah, I find that it's not, it's not something that happens very consciously. It's not that I would edit my poem later to add a Hindi word, but it's probably that I'll sit and the sentence that I think of will have like 60% English and then like 20% something else. And I think that this over the past year, the course that I was working on as a teaching fellow was a course that was a linguistic anthropology course, where the major like academic learning, one of the major academic learnings was that we can't expect to have these like really strong boundaries between different languages. So exploring the ways that different languages can like sort of coexist together is something that I think just had started to happen to me a lot more at the time. Uh, but also, it depends on what the context is. So, for me, if I was writing a poem about Urdu, uh, and it being the language that I would fall in love in, it it made sense for me to also show that with the language, as opposed to just mention it uh, every now and then. Or for I think I there was a there was a poem that I wrote simply because I was very fascinated by the way that the words for I miss you in Korean are I want to see you, bogo shipoyo. And I just found that so beautiful that it like it brought that entire villanelle out of me, despite my like complete, like I'm not very good at Korean. I have very beginner level knowledge, but it happened because
Sometimes it just makes sense,
yeah,
right?
yeah, some words don't exist in other languages, some phrases aren't there in other languages, and then what do?
So because you just talked about your villanelle, I would like you to talk a little bit more about, like, you have three ghazals included in this selection. You have a villanelle, you have an abecedarian, which is quite rare to see, and an abecedarian, it's a daring prospect to attempt an abecedarian and be very serious about what you talk about, right? Because it has this very in the most positive way, this childish quality to it, that because abecedarian itself is a form created to teach children about alphabets. So, like, what is your experience working with traditional forms? Do you find it comforting, or is it challenge? Is it a challenge that you take upon yourself to present yourself in say a ghazal or a villanelle?
um So I think that I've grown up with more exposure to traditional forms than to the like to say free verse and um, unrhymed poetry. I was like I found unrhymed poetry like 3-4 years ago. Until then, it was just like songs that you listen to, or these like poems that you sort of grow up with. So for me, I think one thing that a traditional form does is that it like instantly evokes that feeling of nostalgia. So if I am trying to build a feeling of nostalgia, and if I'm writing about something that makes me feel nostalgic, actually, my default tends to become a traditional form. And uh with something like, say, like the Urdu poem, it it really like wouldn't, I don't think that that poem could have existed in a format that wasn't a ghazal. It was a love poem with Urdu as a main character. And uh it it's because that tradition of ghazals is like so vast and so rich that that poem could like exist, uh and that relationship with that language could exist for me. But for the abecedarian, abecedarian,
Yeah.
I struggle with the word. But I, I think the fact that I was, yeah, I feel like an, like I write like an old person when I'm using traditional forms. So I struggle with, like, I don't know, most other people that I grew up with, like my poetry like classmates and stuff, would write these like really nice like free verse poems, and I I I would be like so impressed and things. But it when I'm writing in a traditional form, the challenge for me is to like to use the traditional form and bring what it does, but also to like sound like myself and not sound like someone's grandmother, which is a struggle. It's
It's fantastic. Like altogether, like reading through your set of poems, I'm quite I quite enjoyed the same, and I congratulate you and wish you good luck for the awards. And let us move on to the next person. Thank you, Swati. And hello, Moa. Can you just hi? Yeah. Hello. Hi. So shall we begin? So
Can you hear me?
yes. So what, like quite enjoy the reading your stories, and specifically expecting caterpillars is such a clincher of a title as well. And it has it's so brief, but it's quite short, grabs your attention, keeps it for the entire duration. And but it is also rife with symbols, for example the caterpillars themselves. And also specifically I was quite intrigued by the symbol of the pond and the wall that has come up around that pond. It kind of leads you to think about the childhood of the speaker and the kind of loss of innocence in some ways, but it also reveals a certain larger degree of tension, that one that is of community, of religion, of politics. Can you talk a little bit more about those concerns in your work?
Yeah, I think it has to do with conflict, and conflict, I think, is inside the story. Like for it to move forward, not just for the reader, but also for the writer as they're writing. Like I do also acknowledge that some writers do not necessarily have like conflict in their stories, and they work, but I can't write a story where there's no conflict for me. Like as for how I draw upon like um, conflict in my writings is that I try not to make it very in your face.
Yeah.
Like it's these subtle moments, like the last glance before someone leaves, or a very subtle handshake, a very firm handshake, or meeting, or that uneasy laugh that someone makes when someone makes an inappropriate joke, something like that. So it's more so about not what is said, but about how one says it, or about what isn't said, and rather what's implied. Readers are very intelligent, and I try not to undermine my readers. So conflict, when subtly put forth, is in this way leaves the door open for them to explore the spacious rooms of conflict, so to say, both externally as well as internally in their own stories. So in this way, the story becomes kind of their own, like the wall that you mentioned, or the wall or pool. It's, for me, as I was writing it, it was just sort of divide between the past and the present, how we often like wish to revel in the past and like live in past glories of the past memories, but then that's not always possible. But all this isn't written down, but it's implied through the story. But again, the reader can take this conflict and in their own way interpret it, and it becomes kind of their story. So yeah, it sure is a very powerful tool for me to explain conflict, and it's usually best done through symbols in one story.
Yeah, you talk about subtlety, right? Like expressing certain things subtly. I think you make very good use of euphemistic expressions as well, to kind of imply certain attitudes that we hold. And I was particularly intrigued by the father of the narrator in Expecting Caterpillars, how he talks about the brother's death, the speaker's brother's death, as an absence. Right, is this a conscious way of for you to highlight the ways in which, as a society, as people, we usually have skirt around certain things that we should actually be talking more about and more openly about?
Yeah, this was a very conscious choice that I like. Initially, while I was starting out writing stories, the idea that came in my head was this. It actually, this story was supposed to be about an ant attacking a family, and then caterpillars attacking that same family after some time. So that was the kernel of the story. But then by the end of the story, it's a completely different story when I was writing it. So while I was developing that story, I had this inclination to write a story that would reflect an aspect of my culture. That is how we do not, it's ubiquitous and it's not necessarily talked about, like how we rarely show emotions, or most importantly, like emotions of love, or like very strong emotions of grief. So this story is obviously, yes, about grief and how these characters handle it. And like, we don't say I love you, or we don't say I'm sorry, we don't hug people in my culture. So this hesitancy to show emotion of what we really feel in our heart, it's so that was what I wanted to explore through the story. Like, it's not like there's this scene in the story where the main character, it's like, finally breaks down, and then grandmother is trying to comfort him, and then she's trying to pet his head, but that's something very foreign for the narrator, and that breaks him down even more. So that kind of exploration of how put it, not necessarily like I was just saying in the previous, I was saying right now, like not in your face, but just kind of implying and how that is explored through the form that I'm writing. So yeah, that was what I wanted to explore.
I think you do that quite impressively, because especially in also in the other story, you have used the word untethering in such an impressive way. Like that's a term that makes you think about that sort of a severance of relationship, right? And I'm quite impressed by that subtlety that you bring into these expressions. Another thing that I want you to talk a little bit about, you just briefly mentioned it. You kind of represent your culture, right? Like your experiences, your culture. So to what degree you think of yourself, you draw quite a bit from your lived experiences, culture, and as far as I understand, you are conscious about the fact that you sometimes need to interpret your culture. You become a sort of interpreter of your culture, that certain things that you talk about may not be obvious to a reader. So how much does that knowledge affect the way in or affect the choices that you make while talking about the experiences, especially also linguistically, there is a lot of choices that you make, that you sometimes have to explain certain words because that might not be familiar to a reader. Many of your target audience might not be familiar with what you are writing. So how much you see yourself as an interpreter of your culture, like how much do you feel is your responsibility to explain, and how much you mentioned quite early on that you see your readers as intelligent, right? So like how much you uh, put the responsibility of on them, and how much you see it as your responsibility?
Yeah, I've grappled with this question for a while now, and like to call myself an interpreter of a culture, it would be putting unwanted burden on myself. Like I have to be this model or writer through whom the world can see my people. And I don't think any one person should be or can even take up the responsibility. But yeah, at the same time, I also know that there are very few Naga writers out there who have the privilege to be canonized and like who bring Naga culture to the forefront. Uh, like I'm especially thinking of people like Dr. Aswin Vijayan and the late Dr. Kumsala Ao. So being from a minority community in a country like India, I do sometimes feel that weight on my shoulder uh, because like very few stories manage to sort of bloom outside of the state where I am, and like sometimes inadvertently, the few stories that do escape, like per se through the story that I wrote, like tend to become this sort of model of what Naga culture is like. And but it's a very dangerous position to be in, for a story to be in, to give that pressure to a single story. And so that kind of precarious position is where writers from many minority communities come from, and yet I do not profess to be an interpreter of culture as such, but simply one of the few voices that made it out of a culture that has not had a voice as much as before. But at the same time, what kind of audience I'm writing from. Like if the story that I'm writing, my intended audience, my own people, then I do not necessarily need to explain every single detail of what is going on. But then again, if I want that story to go out of the boundaries of where I am and to relate for other people to really relate to it, and then some interpretation, some explanation, of course, needs to be there. Like for this fucking caterpillars, that story, it deals with the universal like feeling of grief. Like almost everyone has experienced grief in one way or in one form or another. So that kind of is acts as the binding glue, even though it's from a different part of the world, even though it's like a different culture altogether. That those kind of universal elements are sometimes what helps bind uh, the content with the reader. I mean, with the reader. And I especially like this quote by this. Not I'm not going to quote him, but paraphrase by this American writer called Manny. He sort of advocates for writers, minority communities who often feel the need to explain every single detail of their culture. He sort of advocates for them to write with the arrogance of someone from a majority community, to write as if we are speaking to ourselves and to let everyone else catch up. So I thought that was a very interesting thought in response to this question.
Yeah, brilliant. And see, this also would have probably come up because I know that you have been part of quite a few writing programs, right? So like this thing would have come up quite a bit in those writing programs as well. Can you talk a little bit about like in what ways um, that experience of being part of writing communities, like say an Iowa International Writers Program, like how has that influenced the way you see your writing? How has it influenced the way you see yourself as a writer?
Yeah, so the first thing that I think being a part of a writing community helps in a way that it gives you a sort of solidarity and understanding. Like even when, let's say I mean, we are all shortlisted here for the Toto Awards. So sharing that with a writer friend and the reaction that you get from a writer friend is like very overwhelming, and they know, and because they understand the amount of work and the milieu that we're coming from, as opposed to someone who is not really acquainted with literature and the world of literature. For if I tell someone who's not acquainted with literature, they'll be like, congratulations, and that's kind of the end of it. But then to be able to share that joy with a fellow writer who understands you, that kind of solidarity is, it really helps to have a writing community in that way, to have that, to share that joy with people who understand you. Another thing is resources, like being in a writing community, like your writing peers or your writing mentors, usually they will help you by giving you like resources and sharing like fellowship opportunities or residency opportunities, like, and like awards such as these. So like different kinds of resources that are shared in between the like amongst the community. So that's a really great plus point. And another thing is accountability and encouragement. Like to be a part of writing group means seeing the rise and fall of writers, but more so like if you see, like whenever you see your peers like achieving great things, you're really happy for them, but also at the same time you have this push to sort of push yourself as well. Like if they can do it, I can do it as well, kind of a thing. So that sort of accountability, even though like people don't see it to each other, that kind of encouragement is also always there in between the writing community. Sort of rivalry as well, but at the same time, this encouragement to do better as a writer. And I think it's a really, and another important thing, perhaps the most important thing, I guess, is to be able to workshop and have feedback from your fellow writers, to have someone who genuinely wants to bring out the best in your story, to get into the nitty-gritty of it, break it down, what's happening, what's working for them, what's not working for them, and to be able to sort of gauge how your readers will react to your story in real time. So that's a really great way of how like workshops and having writing communities help you.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Like that one writer friend who can actually see what you're trying to do and set you on the right path is so valuable, and it's so rare. They are so rare to come by, and we value them so much. And once again, congratulations and all the best, and thank you for this conversation. Shall we move on to Aparna? Hi, Aparna.
Hi, Aswin.
Hi. So, in your poetry, something that strikes me quite right away in most of your poetry is that most of it is coming from a very personal, small kind of milieu of individual friendships, of relationships or other relationships with family members, things like that. A lot of the writers here we have already talked to also bring in these things, but there is a subtle way in which you bring a larger social implication of these individual interactions. Like, how do you usually saturate your personal experience into this larger social implications? Like, what is the process?
Yeah, it's not something that I think consciously trying to do, but when I'm writing about, when I'm building some kind of personal world into the poem, I'm aware of the social context that story is the story is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I stay committed to that, to building that small world as much as possible, because maybe one of the more convincing ways of telling or talking about the social is also through the personal, right? That's it's less. I find that it's less disputable. That if you start speak, that if I was to speak about the social at the level of the social, I think that maybe people would be less willing to listen. But if I speak about it as here's the character and this happens to her and look at all her feelings, then who can dispute a feeling, kind of. So that's sort of the way I handle it.
That is actually a very, very powerful, at the same time overpowering kind of sense. Like, who can dispute a feeling? So that can actually be a very, very powerful tool in literature, and as we are seeing these days in politics as well. Like, it's something that is used quite in quite manipulative ways. But coming back to this idea of small things, you also have not just small stories, individualized stories, but also very small moments that you can capture in your work. For example, a father walking his daughter back from kindergarten, or a wedding reception, that a single person attending the wedding reception, and how they see everything that is happening around them. Or in the history of sunlight, you have this chain of smaller moments that kind of create the larger sense. So do you think poetry itself is just a collection of smaller moments than a grand gesture? Or do you think it is better for poetry to be that way? For our moment, poetry better be collection of smaller moments than a grand gesture?
I'm not sure about you're right, in the sense that I'm not interested in the grand gesture. I'm not. But I think what happens is these smaller moments often elicit from me a response that seems like an emotional response that seems disproportionate. And so the poem is kind of the form that allows me to look at, why am I reacting in this way, right? So there's no reason. If my mom and I go to a supermarket and she's finding it difficult to just get down the last step, there's perhaps no reason for me to be in despair about that, right? But then when I'm figuring out this emotion through the poem, then I start to see that, oh, it's 5 years from now it might be the same thing, that physically things are only going to get harder as one ages. And so the poem allows me to also take these smaller moments and kind of put them on some kind of timeline to say, the emotional potency of the small moment, kind of I'm able to excavate that using a timeline to say, this is what came before it, or this is what the moment predicts will come after it, in a way. And so I am interested in the small moments, but for their kind of large emotional headiness.
I think that disproportionate response to a particular moment, I think that's quite fascinating, right? I think that is one of the core things that make your work in particular quite fascinating, like, because they seem to be concerned about the minuscule and the minute, but they are indeed pointing at something much larger, much something of much higher magnitude that you're concerned with. And can you talk a little bit about that poem, Early Days in Chicago, in this context of minuscule moments meaning much larger things?
Sure, yeah. So that poem is Early Chicago Days is it's somewhat autobiographical, and it's looking at, I think, the ways in which me and my family were trying to adjust when we first moved to the United States. And like you were saying before, it's of course talking about the way in which a lot of people who move to a new country have to translate themselves in some way, right? And so it's not something that really happened in this way, and it's linear narrative. Maybe I made up the thing. I'm not really, I don't have a great sense of what I've made up and what really happened. But I think that I was interested in the child's life and the adult's life, and how both of them are trying to translate themselves to suit this new world that they're living in. Yeah.
I love the transition of Murthy into Murphy, and that's such an interesting stroke, and also the sort of innocence of the child protagonist to kind of protect her father from being misunderstood. That desperation, like I think in that minute moment, there is this large desperation that this young child is trying to fulfill, to contain and to kind of preserve her father, who we like usually we understand the father protecting the younger, but here this young child is trying to protect her father from the world by this act of acting out as a certain social scenario which seems acceptable, what society deems as acceptable, rather than what is actually happening. So that is quite that was quite a fascinating poem. It stays with me quite a bit. And you have an interesting relationship with form as well, right? In your poetry, right, you have something that I've found quite often is that sort of a you use vowel sounds quite interesting, quite well, like stoop, droop, stop, like that contrast between a stoop and a stop, the similarity and contrast, and at the same time you use the vowels uh, quite well, and I am quite impressed by that. At this, along with that, you also are using the white spaces on your page in quite interesting ways. Can you talk a little bit about that, those sort of formal choices that you make, and how much white space is important to you, how much freedom you think you have with it?
Um, okay. I think one is when I'm writing because I'm writing in free verse, I have to find a way to create some kind of rhythm on the page. And one way of doing that is, like you're saying, the vowel can do that. And the other way is to find visual rhythm on the page, right? So blank space can create that some kind of visual rhythm. It can kind of set up for the reader an expectation that, okay, this is how we're going to read the poem, that there's going to be silences in the poem now and then, right? So it's setting up some kind of pattern of reading, which can be useful when I'm trying to convince the reader that this is not a paragraph, it's a poem. So yeah, the other thing is in terms of trying to do these tricks with form is I've been writing about the same things and the same people for about 7-8 years now. So the way to make it interesting for myself is to keep doing something with the form. That's the way I can sustain the writing. Yeah.
Also, yeah, like that sort of sense of identity also, right? Like that comes from like a poem sense of identity. See, this is a poem, this is not prose, like this is poem, I have this integrity and identity. And identity is something that you highlight using white space in one of your poems, Engaged. In that poem, you use that white spacing and kind of isolates the nouns and pronouns to the margin of the page almost, to kind of say that the we and I and Vasu and Vasuda, all of this is what is important in this poem. You also almost forces the reader to reckon that this is what is important about this poem. Everything else is the poem, but this is what is important. Can you talk a little bit about that choice?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I should say is this form is something that I've learned from reading Mani Rao and my teacher Kala Krishnan.
Yeah.
So I think what it does is it's a choice that I made kind of after writing the first draft of the poem, and I was reworking, and I realized that I am interested in telling the story of me and my friend and how our relationship is changing, but the story is secondary. It's actually I want the reader to see the people before they see anything else, right? I wanted to kind of foreground that look at how the way we're using language with each other has been changing, right? That now when I ask her about you, the reply is always we, or whatever the shift is in language, and that's the form is kind of reflecting the poem is kind of reflecting what I want the reader to focus on in the story. Yeah.
It's quite fascinating. Like even in Half Full, you kind of uses that idea of being half and being full in that relationship. Certain image that sticks to my mind is that of turning the knob half to full and then back again to half. That's sort of a visual that you create using, and the blockiness of text in that poem kind of conveys that sense of halfness and fullness in an interesting way also. So I like your interaction with the form and why it's as you said, like when someone is working with free verse, there are limited ways to keep it interesting, keep it fresh, and it's appreciable that you make the best use of the resources you have. Talking about the resources you have, like how are your social interactions, other social interactions and social commitments, including, I understand that you teach. So how are these social commitments feed into the poetry that you write? Because you feed your poetry with your personal instances, moments, interactions. So how does these other social interactions, extensive interactions, usually feed into this aspect of writing?
Okay, so let me talk about my teaching. Well, one is, I think, being part of the writing classroom, it brings a lot of energy into my work, especially if I'm.
Do you teach writing?
I do teach writing, and so I think it creates some kind of energy in me to keep the work going. And sometimes there's a question that we encounter in class that we're not able to really answer, and then I pursue that question even when I come home, so there's definitely that. Yeah, sometimes like you were mentioning Half Full, that one of the poems that I submitted. So sometimes the work is, the way that poem happened was I read a prose poem online that really stayed with me, and I was kind of reading it over many days, and I tried out the form myself. So this idea of the poem that's a long prose poem that's one sentence, and so it was fun and interesting, and I was, I but it wasn't my work wasn't really working, the first draft that I had. And then what I did was I took it to class. The poem I found on the internet, I took it to class, and it was a class that I didn't yet really have a relationship with, so it felt kind of scary or risky or something. So I took it to class, and the students were, extremely generous, and they read it, and the class ended kind of with each of them writing in the same style a paragraph about, a stanza in one line about a friend that they had growing up or something. And then when they shared their work and we had feedback and responses, I think some things became clear to me, but just through our discussion together. So they, for example, the poem that's one long sentence, it kind of is depending on the persona of the speaker, right? It's the persona of the speaker that's carrying the poem, because it's not just words, it's one long sentence. There's a certain kind of person who's going to speak one long sentence without pausing, right? So there's something about tone and pacing and all of that I learned in that class that I have to pay attention to. And so in that way, it's the energy, like my creative writing practice is kind of allowing me to bring something to the classroom to make sense in the classroom, and the students, of course, give me back that energy. So it's that kind of a relationship. Although, I have to say also, I'm a new teacher. It's been about 2 years, and I don't think I have a lot of creative writing stamina. Like sometimes I come home and I feel really tired. Like I've been discussing writing the whole day. I've been reworking things the whole day, and so sometimes it can feel a little draining. So I should say that part too, that it's both things. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Because you are investing a particular kind of energy into the classes, and it's very similar energy that you have to expend on your own writing as well. So it gets divided. I completely understand. But it is enriching and nourishing in one way, but it is also, it also divides your energy into, it dissipates kind of sometimes into in many directions. You have submitted a fascinating collection of poems, and congratulations on this making to the shortlist, and good luck for the awards. And with that, we come to the conclusion of this conversation. And from on behalf of TFA, I wish all of you the best of luck for 18th February, and everybody who is listening, everybody who is watching this conversation, I would encourage to be part of the award ceremony and encourage our young writers. And congratulations once again, all of you. Keep in touch.
Thank you.